I found that when I encouraged small group leaders to turn to inquiry more than answers, and that's really tough, right? Like the leader is the one that when someone presents a challenge or a problem or a question has the answer. But that's like super counter to creating a safe environment because most adults want to be seen as competent by our peers. So I found that if you could get leaders to think a little differently about some of those things and subtly make some changes in how they would hold a question or respond to a question, you could actually create much more vibrant communities because people felt safer to be real, to be themselves.
Welcome back to another episode of Good Work. My name is Barrett Brooks. I'm your host, and this is a show made up of long-form interviews with people who are world-class at what they do, make great money doing it, and want to make an impact through their work and career. My guest today is Andy Crissinger. Andy Crissinger is a world-class coach who was previously in charge of coaching development and also a coach himself at a company called Reboot. If you listen to the early episodes of the show, Jerry Colonna, the founder of Reboot, was on episode 3. And Andy is the person who led all of coach development at that firm. He's worked with some of the leaders of the most well-known startups and companies in the world. He is a master facilitator and an expert level coach. In this conversation, we talk about his journey to coaching through ministry, through startup leadership, and eventually finding his seat and his home as a coach guiding leaders to become the people, the leaders, the executives that they were made to be. He is a fantastic human being and he's an incredible coach. And in the second half of this conversation, after we talk about his personal story that I think everyone will have something to relate to, we get into a coaching curriculum through the lens of 5 different books, all of which are fantastic resources for you to do your own inner growth as a person. And even if you can't afford a $3,000 or $5,000 coach like Andy, you can read books like the ones Andy recommends to his clients. And we do a walkthrough of what coaching can offer you through the lens of these books. And we hope that maybe it'll be the kind of resource that helps you become the leader you're meant to be, become the professional you're meant to be, and become the person, the partner, the parent that we know you can be. Please enjoy this conversation with Andy Crissinger. Let's get to it. Andy Crissinger, welcome to the show.
Hey, it's great to be here.
Great to have you here. The place I want to start, hopefully you'll know what the question means, is who is Leonard?
Who is Leonard? I think we're talking about Leonard Cohen.
Maybe.
Yep.
I don't know because I only know the title of the SoundCloud album. I don't know if we would call it an album.
It's a private SoundCloud playlist.
Okay. A private SoundCloud playlist so that you shared with me of your music.
Yeah.
And it says For Leonard as part of the title of it. So I was curious who Leonard is.
Well, first of all, about the playlist, it's a set of demos of my most recent batch of songs that I'm slowly working on recording. It's been a multi-year project. So the title of that playlist, which I was kind of using as a working title for the album, is For Leonard, If He's Still Here. And it's an obscure reference to a live version of Bob Dylan's song Isis, one of my favorite Bob Dylan songs. And you can find this live version, I think, on one of his greatest hits. And it's an awesome version of the song. In fact, you can see a live version of it on the documentary Rolling Thunder Review, which is, I think, still on Netflix. And it's just this crazy performance. Dylan's got like face makeup on and he's probably on some substances, but he's just like electric on stage. It takes place in Montreal, which is the home of Leonard Cohen. And at the beginning of the song on the album version, the live album version, you can hear him say, "This is a song about marriage. It's for Leonard, if he's still here." And I think I've always been intrigued by these sort of Easter egg, like conversations between great artists that I love. And I don't know why that little piece of the live song just always stuck in my mind. The idea of For Leonard, if he's still here. And of course, Leonard Cohen passed away a couple years ago. One of my favorites, all-time favorite songwriters. just an amazing artist. So as I was returning to songwriting a couple of years ago after some time, I mean, I've always written songs and always played the guitar, and I keep a guitar in my office, as you know, and it's the thing I do for stress relief throughout the workday. But as I was really committing to trying to finish songs again and maybe try to record them, it just seemed like a meaningful nod to an inspiration and someone who had recently passed, but was still very much with me through his art. So
It's beautiful. I remember when I learned that you were a musician, it did not surprise me. It actually felt like it fit perfectly, but it was definitely a layer of depth that I hadn't seen prior to you revealing that to me. And then to listen to your music is a whole different layer of depth. You know, you call yourself kind of a hobbyist musician. A lot of hobbyist musicians who would call themselves that don't also record music. They just play for fun. And so there is some part of you that I think takes it seriously enough and enjoys it enough that you want a record of it, even if just for yourself. And I'm just curious what music represents to you. Like, when did it come into your life, and what role has it played in your life over the years?
yeah, what a question. I mean, music has always been a really important part of my life. Although what's interesting is I didn't really commit to playing it and creating it until much later than a lot of people do. So I was in my late teens, early college, when I finally learned the guitar after a couple false starts.
Wow.
Throughout my growing up years. I did take piano lessons. We had a piano in our home. My mom is a singer. Her siblings were singers. And a lot of my exposure to music happened in church. But then I discovered the radio and pop music and rock music. And it just was always something that I always felt a little different than most people who would listen to music ambiently. It was like important, but not that important. Even as a playing musician, songs were important to me. Lyrics were important to me. I knew that it seemed like an outsized impact on me, on my mood, on my ability to experience joy. So it's always been there in that form. And then the stars kind of aligned early college. I lived with a guy who played guitar as a roommate, and I got a guitar and I just pushed through all of the pain of, all the finger pain and all the things you have to get through to learn how to play guitar. And really what I was wanting to do, I wanted to learn it enough so that I could write songs. So I never really progressed as a guitarist. Probably made more progress in the last 5 years than I did the first, whatever it was, 20 years of playing. But I wanted to write songs. Mm-hmm. And putting together a set of chords and a melody and lyrics, I kind of caught the bug in my late teens, early 20s. And I don't know if I answered the question fully.
You did. It brought up another one for me, though, which is, what in you gets expressed through writing songs that doesn't have another way to get expressed?
It's probably similar to what a lot of people who write songs say. I mean, or poetry, which is also something I've dabbled in. Like the easy thing to say is there's a way to express emotion, but it feels like it's more than just emotion. There's a way to express, reflect the nature of reality, the aspects that are more mysterious, oblique, the connections that are less obvious. My lyrics tend to be more impressionistic. I like that. I love language, and I love putting words together, and then only later maybe seeing some of the connections that my subconscious was making. So there's an aspect of tapping into intuition and subconscious, and probably the spiritual domain as well that I can connect with through songwriting. It's harder, through other means.
Yeah. There's something about, to me, both poetry and music, especially for people who create those things, that's almost like soul level connection. We spend so much time in our heads, and so much of everything, writing, speaking, communication, is logic level stuff. And if we're really skilled, sometimes we can get good at communicating our emotions, but that kind of like soul level of stuff is a lot harder to express in ways that make sense to other people. And I think there's just something about, when I listen to you playing music, or when I hear you reference lines of lyrics or from poems, or you read poetry, it just feels like it's that deeper layer of thing that you're trying to communicate, like something from deep inside that just doesn't have another way to come out. It's one of the only ways to do it.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. Absolutely. Yeah.
I love that. Well, you touched on a little bit of upbringing, talking about the piano and early experiences with music. And one of the stories you shared with me as we prepped for this was this experience of watching your dad go through some real hardship at work growing up. And he had to leave a couple of jobs because of concerns he had over kind of the moral implications of decisions he was being asked to make. And I was wondering how, you kind of mentioned that shaped you in a lot of ways, and it shaped the work you ended up doing. And I was curious how, what impact did that have on you watching your dad go through that, and how has that played out for you throughout your career?
Yeah, this is something that I've talked a little bit about, particularly with groups. When I'm facilitating with teams, I'll often do an exercise, especially for wanting to work on helping a team build trust and really get to know each other and coalesce. I'll do this exercise where I invite them to share an experience from their growing up years, adolescence, childhood that has shaped the adult professional that they are today. And there's a way that we'll do it where they end up getting to share with each other and then share on behalf of each other's story. But I'll often share this part of my experience as my example to the group, as this is an example of something you might share. And because I've been able to retell it over and over, I think I've done some sense making around it, and I feel like I have a better sense of how it shapes me. But
so sense making is language that you and I have because of just because we know each other. But I'm curious how you would describe sense making to someone who's never heard that word before you get into it.
We go through our lives, we have experiences. Those experiences shape us, often in ways we're unaware of, often unconsciously. And in this case, I guess I'm using sense making as a way of reflecting back on experience, making sense of that experience, drawing conclusions that then help me really kind of take more of an active agent relationship with my own narrative, my own personal narrative and story.
Yeah.
And that can be really empowering. So that's what I mean by sense making in that context.
Great.
Yeah. So yeah, my dad was in savings and loans in the 80s. Maybe a lot of the audience is too young to know what that means. I was pretty young. I was a kid. You can kind of go back and look at Wikipedia for the savings and loan industry and the way that it kind of imploded during that time. But my dad was in that industry and had two jobs sequentially when I was in sixth grade, one in Jacksonville, Florida, and then one later down in Central Florida. He actually was fired from both of them. And in both cases, it was because of him either refusing to do a thing that was being asked of him that he felt was outside of his integrity or legality. And it happened, I guess, the middle of my sixth grade year. And then we moved. And within 3 months of this new job that he took in Central Florida, it's like the pattern just played out again.
Golly.
So, I'm 12 years old, preteen, trying to figure out the world. I didn't understand fully what my dad did, but I knew he went to an office. I knew money was involved. And I knew that there were people, I internalized that there were people more powerful than him who it kind of didn't matter if he was morally in the right, because they had more power than him. They could exert some control over his ability to provide for his family, keep his job, these sorts of things. So the way that shaped me, it shaped me in positive and in challenging ways. So the positive was just I was really proud of my dad for his integrity, for his moral courage, for standing up to people with more power and paying the cost. And it was hard on our family. The years after that, he ended up going to work for the Resolution Trust Corporation, which was the government entity that was going in and kind of closing down and resolving the books for all these failed savings and loans, which meant he was working away from us. He was gone during the weeks. He missed most of my basketball games in junior high during the week. So it was a hard time for us as a family, but we were okay. And we made it through that time. My parents' marriage survived what could have been was really challenging for them.
Mm-hmm.
So watching him show up with that kind of strength and resolve and integrity was a core shaping experience of my childhood. But what I didn't come to realize until years later was that it actually on a more unconscious level shaped what I allowed myself to think I could do professionally. I think there was just a part of my brain that was I will not be in the corporate world. I will not be in business. I will gravitate towards other spheres. that are safer, that are more morally pure, that are more that are anchored more around things like truth, beauty, goodness. So, I studied English lit in college without a real plan of what I like what that was going to mean. I had this vague sense that maybe I would teach, be a professor. I did end up teaching first on the high school level, and then as an adjunct, kind of still ambivalently mulling a PhD in English. And then after that, as you know, I found my way to pastoral ministry, and I spent 6 years as a pastor. So I went to the academy, and I went to the community of faith to find vocational fulfillment. And of course, what I found was humans are humans in whatever sphere they organize and gather in. So there's no domain that is safe from the kinds of behavior that my dad encountered in a corporate financial institution.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to think about the implications of those kinds of experiences and the way that we observe as children our parents' own experiences. You did not experience that directly, but you experience all the fallout from it. We're going to spend the second half of this conversation talking about some of the books that have shaped kind of your coaching, or that you use to shape the experience of the people that you work with in your coaching. And one of them is It Didn't Start With You. And I think that one is an interesting exploration of this kind of topic of like, what are these things that you've experienced, but maybe aren't yours per se, how those have shaped you over time. To your point, like that kind of, it's a sense-making tool for noticing these things and how they show up. And to your point, this showed up as, well, I better find something more pure than the kind of environment my dad found himself in, because that will be a better path for me. And I won't be at risk of going through the same kind of pain that he experienced. That's not necessarily been the case along the way. We may or may not get to that, but when did you know, or when did you have a sense that it was time to kind of enter this ministry path? Because, one wouldn't necessarily think, okay, studied English, went and taught English, and now ministry. So what was the point at which you reached this conclusion that like, I need to go in a new direction, and what was going on in your life at the time?
Yeah, well, it's funny as you say that. I was just remembering that as a young child who grew up in the church, I can actually remember being afraid as a kid that God would, quote unquote, call me to ministry, and I didn't want to do it. Probably a lot of people, if anyone's kind of grown up in sort of we'll just say American Protestant Christianity that I did, they might share that. I've heard other people say that they've had similar feelings. So that's just kind of a funny aside. But I left, I went to college. I kind of went on my own spiritual pilgrimage that took me away for a time from the faith that I had been raised in. And then there was this kind of turning point around my senior year where I would say it was a kind of return, but a return on slightly different terms. There was a re-embracing of some aspects of the core of the faith, really, but I had to kind of find my way back in. And that's a long story, but hopefully that is at least, abstractly, helpful in this. So at the time, I was having this sort of spiritual renewal around the time that I was finishing college, meeting Michelle, who would become my wife, and she was on a similar journey. So at that time, I remember being just interested in how people come together and form communities of faith. I was already in a master's degree program. I wasn't going to drop everything and go to seminary at that point, but I just had this like intrigue, and we had been a part of a couple newly formed churches. And so I was interested in community, how community was being formed in those instances. And so it was that, probably mixed with my ambivalence about doing a PhD in English, and then with just a window of opportunity opening for me at a time where we were a part of a church that needed help. And it was a kind of help that I could provide while I was still teaching. And so I started doing that, and it just kind of blossomed pretty quickly into a broader opportunity. And that I started working full-time for that church and going to seminary all at once. And it was a very non-traditional way that people become ministers,
right?
In kind of the current context. But I just kind of walked through that door and went for it.
One of the things you've said that you picked up during that time was kind of how small groups work, how community forms, like you just mentioned, and what it's like to try and facilitate that. if I've learned anything about community, it's that it doesn't just appear. There really are things happening that make communities come together, that make groups work. And so I'm curious, in those kind of early innings of developing perspective on this, which has become, I think, a core thread of your work over the years, what did it teach you about small group dynamics and facilitating community?
Probably, I know we're going to talk about books in the second half of the episode, but maybe if we can start to foreshadow a little bit. One of the books that I think you wanted to talk about is Helping by Ed Schein, which I did not discover until I was actually in the field, so to speak, or beginning in the field of executive coaching. But much of what Schein talks about in that book, I was beginning to learn in other ways and internalize in other ways during that time that I was experimenting with small groups and community. And it has a lot to do with the conditions that whoever is the facilitator, and it doesn't have to be one person, but whoever is holding the kind of, to use some more coach language, the container of that group, like the container that can hold the content and the meaning and the relationships of that group of humans. There are some ways that you can create conditions that are safe for people to show up and be vulnerable and to trust that they can be a little bit more of themselves. But that does require some work, and it requires a little bit of the stemming of the tide where the group typically wants to go. So like one example is I found that when I encouraged small group leaders to turn to inquiry more than answers, and that's really tough in a faith-based community, right?
Yeah,
like
right.
we're sort of internalized that like the leader is the one that when someone presents a challenge or a problem or a question has the answer, they know where to go in, scripture or whatever, and
here's
they
a
can
verse for you. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. But that's like super counter to creating a safe environment because most adults want to be seen, like we want to be seen as competent by our peers. To put ourselves in a vulnerable place by asking a question can cause us to feel sort of like, as Schein talks about, one down in the kind of,
or losing face a little bit. Yeah.
Exactly. So I found that if you could get leaders to think a little differently about some of those things and subtly make some changes in how they would hold a question or respond to a question, that you could actually create much more vibrant communities because people felt safer to be real, to be themselves.
It's really beautiful. I think I'm a community builder. I think that that's kind of like a core part of my identity is I want to bring people together. I want to create spaces where they can connect. And I think about these different experiences I've had over the years of, we led a small group here in Portland that was part of our Catholic church. I host a breakfast club, and I'm just thinking back, this highlight reel of different situations was playing through my mind as you were sharing that, of how people show up the first time versus the 10th time, and how you set kind of community guidelines or ground rules for how you want people to engage that allows them the permission to not have to have an answer, or to maybe like fight that urge to say, well, here's the answer to your problem. Because it really does take something away from the experience if someone comes to the group and says, here's this thing that I'm challenged with right now. There's this difference in, is there a default belief in the group reflected through their actions that that person is capable of solving their own problem?
Yeah.
Or is there a default belief that because they are incapable, we must solve it for them? And that's never the explicit belief system at play, right? I don't think anyone answering a question is thinking, well, since you're so incapable, let me tell you the answer here. Yeah. But I think that's a lot of the way that it gets internalized. It may be explicit in some
religious circles.
That's true. You're right. That's true.
But I see what you mean. Yeah. Sorry. Keep going.
Yeah. No. That's true though. And in some cases, even in non-religious circles, I think that can be the case, right? As I have the answers. You are kind of like asking me to solve your problems for you. People are impressive though, man. They can solve their own problems if given the right set of kind of support and tools and community. And I think that really is the power, really bringing people together, in my view, is it allows people that place where they can come and share what's going on and then know that they're capable of going and dealing with it however they need to.
Absolutely. And I think this is also why when I discovered coaching while I was in ministry, I didn't get trained while I was a pastor, but I discovered coaching. I shared this with you. I was at a conference in Atlanta, this large church there that was hosting a conference mostly about small groups and how to create these vibrant kind of transformational groups. And they kept talking about coaching. like, this is how we support our leaders through coaching. And I was not familiar with that terminology. This would have been 2009, right after the time our oldest daughter, Beulah, was born.
Way before the coaching boom.
Yeah, definitely. Although it was starting to, like, some books had been written. It was starting to kind of like, it was still a more fledgling. It hadn't reached the mainstream in the way
Right.
that it has now. But it was enough, there'd been enough published that I could go buy some books and like read about this. And I remember just like light bulbs were going off for me, largely because of what you just articulated. I was really attracted to a form of helping that did not require one person to be above the other in sort of like teacher-student kind of dynamic. Not that it was antithetical to that, but it didn't require that. And it just
Right.
gave this different way of helping that was, very much affirming of the giftedness, the brilliance, the resilience that was alive in that person that you were helping. They weren't deficient,
Right.
you know?
Right.
They were actually quite enough.
I love that. Even a lot of coaching today, and I'll try not to be gripey here, but there's a lot of what gets called coaching today, I would not say is coaching as I would define it. There's a lot of coaching, quote unquote, programs that are actually teaching programs. And maybe there's a lot of live teaching and there's groups and things like that. But oftentimes it's not coaching in this sense, where there's unconditional positive regard and the ability to trust the other person to solve their own problems. And like a lot of the core tenets of what I think, I consider myself as coming up through the school of Andy and Reboot and like, a lot of these things. So I'm going to be aligned to you in this way. But in what I think I've learned from you, I don't see that as coaching. It's something important and still valuable in the world, but a lot of what gets called coaching is not what we're talking about here. And so there's an important distinction there, I think, that I'm often trying to help people understand. When you're looking for help, what type of help are you looking for?
Right.
Is it coaching, as you and I are talking about
Right.
it right now, or is it actually education and something where you're trying to understand concepts and fundamentals and things that are secrets that you can know the answer to,
I agree with you. I'll also just say, I think there's a gradient, and to all of this.
Spectrum.
And, maybe the counterpoint to this is that I think there's also become a kind of orthodoxy among kind of coaching, which at times I think can feel too restrictive and wooden, where, a lot of the coach training programs, I agree, because we're talking about it, I agree with the fundamental premise here, which is that the client is whole, the client is resourceful, the client is the only one who can truly solve their own problems. I agree with all of that. But I think at times that can become sort of like this, there's this fundamentalism that can kind of come into play there. It's like, which means I can never share my own perspective, or I can never speak from experience in that relationship. And I just think that just gets weird. And it feels super weird for a client, because the conversation is overly restrictive and bounded. And it's not like two people talking.
Right.
There's like this weird coach speak that can happen. So that, there's gradients to this, and there's room to break the rules.
Yes.
In elegant and helpful ways.
Yeah, in intentional ways. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to talk a lot more about coaching, but I want to stay here with the ministry piece for a moment. And this is a really important chapter of your life. And when I think about people entering into ministry, going to seminary, studying in the way that you did, finding something that I think felt important to you at the time, I think of that like a kind of one-way door. When I think of ministry, I'm like, okay, you're on the ministry path now. And that is where you are going to be for a very long time, maybe your whole life. But you moved out of it, obviously, because you're a coach now. And I'm curious kind of when you first sensed that it might not be a one-way door for you, that it might actually just be a door that opened up that led you somewhere else.
Well, you're right that it tends to be a one-way door. I actually think that's a big problem, though. I think it's a big problem for people in ministry. I think it's a big problem for people who are in churches led by those folks. It is to be captive in a profession. And some of it is really practical. Like, you train in a very specific way to do a very specific job. And while I do think a lot of those skills are transferable, it's pretty hard to leave and go find your way into, it's really, really hard. And I think, unfortunately, it leaves a lot of people stuck. in the profession who probably ought not to be there. That has all sorts of implications on those people's lives, their families. It's a challenging profession, psychologically, emotionally, spiritually. So I'll just say that. I feel thankful to have found my way to meaningful work after ministry. There was definitely a long time that I thought, this is it. This is my calling. I'm where I'm supposed to be. And when I left the particular role that I was in at the church where I was, even then I thought, I just need a breather and I'm going to take some time. I'm going to do some other work. I will find my next opportunity.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So even then I thought I would go back, but I found my way to a tech startup and started to realize, oh, this is pretty fun. And that's when I got trained as a coach during that time period. And I remember it was like week after week after week of me realizing, oh, some of these skills and abilities that I've been cultivating are quite applicable here. I'm at a little bit of a disadvantage because I've really got to catch up to context and a lot of different things. So it was very much like starting over again, like being a newbie, being a neophyte in some ways. But then there was a lot of stuff that I was bringing, like wisdom in terms of like how human beings work, how organizations work, how leadership works, that I was not at a deficit at all, really. I just was learning a new context. So that's how it worked for me. I mean, it really was an evolution. It took time. But I think what I realized was so much of what I was pursuing unconsciously with my career choices was always about helping people and always about being of service to people in their growth. I started in a classroom, I moved to a congregation, and then I ended up in organizations and working with leaders. But that's the through line through all of that.
Yeah. So if there was a calling, it was probably more like that than any one instantiation of that along the way.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. That makes sense to me. Yeah. I find it fascinating, and I'm going to use this as a pen because I want to go back and pull on one thread that we missed along the way. I find it fascinating that eventually you found your way kind of through experimentation into business, which was kind of the thing that you said, I'm not going to do that, right? If we go back to the story of your dad and his experience and what you took away from that on the downside.
And so just to be clear, I don't know that I ever said it. I think it was unconsciously a choice.
Under the surface, yeah.
Yeah.
And it had been kind of like quietly guiding you to these other places, the academy, as you put it, the ministry.
Right.
And now you've found this kind of like third outlet. And so I just want to pin that real quick, but I want to go back. And you mentioned that your first child, Beulah, was born around the time that you were kind of like in this ministry place, discovering coaching and headed towards the startup that you ended up in. And that was after years of you all wanting to have children, but not being able to at the time. And there's this really fascinating, transformative journey in that of going from a long-term experience of infertility, the desire for children, but not being able to have them. And then the kind of capstone of that arc being holding your first child in your hands. And I wonder kind of how that arc of experience of the hardship and the pain of the years of wanting something that you couldn't have, and then the joy and the hope of holding it in your hands, what that arc was like for you.
How to summarize 6 years of that experience? Well, I mean, the headline it was at the time the hardest experience that Michelle and I had ever gone through in our lives. It was strange for me as the husband in that situation because I felt like I was always a year or two behind Michelle in the grieving process of our infertility. I think that's probably pretty common. Maybe not universal, but probably quite common.
Infertility is increasingly common. And I think that I was watching this, there are some shows I watch purely for their formulaic comfort. And one of them is SEAL Team. So for listeners that want little flavors of my personality along the way. And anyways, in SEAL Team last night, which I was watching as a escape mechanism from just what's going on in the world, there's this line where one of the SEALs said, well, women have always been better at loss and grief than men. we tend to hide our pain or drown it out with other things or something like that. And it was a reflection of what you just said. It's fascinating to me that was like the last line I listened to before I went to sleep last night. And now here you are saying a similar thing. I don't know what that is. And we'll talk a little bit about grief in the second half of the conversation, but there is something there that on average, my experience is also that it just takes me longer than it takes my wife or, the female women and leaders and people I look up to in my life. It takes me longer to sit in it and really process it. I've gotten better at it, but it's just a fascinating thing to me that there seems to be something there.
Yeah, I think I know what you're getting at. I think, with our experience, at least in infertility, one of the things I noticed was that there was just this monthly reminder that this has not happened.
We're still in it. Yeah.
We're still in it. And so the closeness of the experience in that regard was at least a part of it. Also, I think I was still trying to figure out who I was going to be professionally at that time. So there was probably a part of me that was on some level okay not having the responsibility of fatherhood. I can say that now, I think,
Right.
looking back. But I caught up. I mean, I in terms of it, I had my own experience, and probably 4 years in was when I was really feeling the loss of not being a parent. Whereas Michelle was still feeling that, but probably had come through some of the grief, these stages a little bit more fully. It was a reminder for us, of how not in control we were of certain aspects of our lives, that we could do all of the right things and not get the outcome that we wanted. So it was hard, and I can see, looking back, how that grief and that loss matured us and shaped us. And not everyone has the story that we have. I recognize that. It's a little weird talking about infertility when you have come through it and have children. I found like it's hard I feel a little bit awkward talking about it when other people may be in the midst of it and experiencing it, because the last thing I want to do is like, oh, and the story, every story has a happy ending, and we have 3 beautiful children, and we do, but I know that that's not true.
Yeah,
for
it's just
everyone.
one of the possible outcomes, of the whole process. Yeah. I can appreciate that. And I love you for your compassion. I mean, it's one of the things I love most about you. And there's this thing of like relative grief, relative pain, relative experience that, I guess with the show, it's just, I want to highlight these things because there just are different experiences of these things. If you were sitting here and you hadn't been able to have children, I would still ask you about the experience.
Yeah.
And I would want you to be able to share it, because this is just the real shit of being a human being.
Yep.
And this is just your flavor of it,
For sure. It is. It's a part of our story. It's a huge part of what has made us who we are. It's a core shared experience of our marriage. But yes, we did, after 6 years of infertility, get pregnant, and we had Beulah.
What was that moment like when you found out you all were pregnant? It was the first month when it wasn't that disappointing realization that you were still in it. You realized something has changed. What was that like?
Well, it's hard to answer that question without maybe telling a little bit of the story of the circumstances. Is it okay if I share just a little bit about this? So I was in ministry at the time. There was a partner ministry in Guatemala that our church did work with, and we would send teams down and we would support their ministry financially. And we developed a friendship with the gentleman who was the founder of that ministry. And he was in his 70s at the time and had actually been a successful entrepreneur who had kind of gone through a midlife crisis of sorts, lost his business, lost his family, had a spiritual transformation, and then through a crazy series of events, found himself down in the highlands of Guatemala in this village called Chichicastenango, running a ministry that built homes and fed children, and was kind of integral in that community. He was the kind of guy who, of a different era. He would just say whatever, whatever he felt, kind of unfiltered. We were down there having had multiple years of this infertility experience. And he was just sort of like, I'm going to pray for you and you're going to get pregnant. And it was like the kind of thing that if one of our friends back home had said that, it would have felt like really uncompassionate and
like insensitive.
Yeah. Like why would you say that? I mean, as if we haven't been praying or other people haven't been praying,
Like a little bit, you want to smack them across the head after they say
totally.
that.
Yeah. But he kind of got a pass because he was this like grandfatherly figure to us. And, but anyway, he did pray for us. And it was 2 weeks after that trip that we had our positive pregnancy test. So you could imagine the weeks leading up to that was like, do we open our hearts up to this? Like, is this a thing? So
is it okay to hope after so many years of being let down? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So that's kind of what the 2 week period was like. So when we got the positive test, it wasn't just the 6 years and then all of a sudden like, oh wow, look, it happened. It was like the 6 years and then this sort of like really strange like threshold moment of like, are we going to hope here? And then I think Michelle was more like in a place of hope. I was kind of there, not so sure, so it was, it was pretty amazing to have that happen. And then of course it's like, well, now what's going to happen? Can we, it's 9 months before the baby's actually here, so there's a lot to be fearful of. But it turned out to be amazing. And Beulah's here. She's 15. She's driving. It's incredible. And we have 2 more, Kaya and Judah, are 13 and 11.
Yeah.
So
it's a really beautiful, to your point, it's kind of like the classic story arc of a desire that sends you out on a journey and all of the progressive hardship along the way. And then this kind of like climactic moment of resolution of having children. And yes, some people's resolution is that they accept that they're not going to. But for you, you're now a dad of 3 amazing kids. You've been at it for 15 years now. It's got to be wild to just hear reflected back to you. Curious just kind of how the experience of fatherhood has shaped the way you move through the world.
Boy, these are doozies of questions.
Just a little light fare.
Whew. Just like
you're gonna be emotionally hungover after this.
Yeah,
we're gonna get into more coaching fare here in a bit.
Yeah, can you ask me about coaching? Oh man, how has fatherhood shaped me? I mean, in myriad ways that I'm sure I couldn't even count. I mean, it has stretched me. I mean, I guess the big thing is like I coach for a living, and so I spend my time living in other people's stories and like reflecting that back and being super curious and everything. But fatherhood reminds me on a regular basis how much more I have to learn and grow in that kind of others orientation. I mean, it is such a crucible. I mean, I love them so much. I want so much for them, but I want them to be their own people. I want to meet their needs, and there's 3 of them and they have a lot of needs. And so that was a big thing, like just reckoning with my own limitation as a person, as a human. I cannot be perfect for each of them all the time, and I'm certainly not. So that has been a humbling and I think forming part of the experience. Yeah, gosh, I feel like there's so much more I could say, but the gravity of the question has me a little bit stumped.
That's okay. If it comes to you, if we come to it over the rest of our conversation, feel free to drop it in. But
okay.
Even that is beautiful. I just love hearing about how parenthood or the absence of that shapes people. It's fascinating to me because probably I've seen how it's shaped me already in the 5 years I've been a dad.
How would you answer that question?
The most
Not
concrete
so easy, is it?
and immediate way is that I think becoming a father has really forced me through the lens of what do I want for my sons to become more of who I am, to like unabashedly lean into who I really am and showing up as that for them, because I do not want any part of them to feel like they can't show up as themselves because their dad couldn't. And so I think that's probably like everything else that's happened ladders up to that.
Yeah.
that being a dad was the ultimate permission slip to basically say like, this, I'm not living like this anymore in a bunch of different ways. And you helped me through a lot of that, which we'll get to. And so I think that's kind of the
great
blankest
answer.
thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
I've thought a lot about this though, because I've been writing about it, and there's been a lot going on that front. So anyways, that's my blanket answer. Okay, so I want to start transitioning us to, because we could stay on the fatherhood thing and these deep topics of meaning and purpose and how we get shaped forever, because we're both so fascinated by it. And I think that is because we both play roles in our lives now where we are in other people's stories so much. I mean, this very thing that we're doing right now is me playing that role and you being in your story for a change, which I love. But the work of coaching is fundamentally about supporting others through all of these things that we've been talking about on their journey of sense making, of being an active player in their own lives, and like all of these things that we know we do. And you found two things: coach training while you're at the ed tech startup that you went through, and then also you discovered the Reboot crew that you would end up going to work with for a period of time. Yeah. And I wonder how those things kind of came across your desk. And I'm specifically interested in whether when you first encountered the Reboot crew, there was anything that went off in you that was kind of like the work equivalent of love at first sight, where you felt like there might be something there that I want to pursue, or if it was more something that developed over time.
Yeah. So, okay, let me answer the first part of the question. So the startup that I went to work for was co-founded by a friend of mine named Kevin and Dan Putt, who you know as one of the co-founders of Reboot.
Yeah.
I didn't know Dan then, but Kevin was the one who kind of brought me in, and Kevin Friedman. Kevin and Dan had been brought together by Jerry Colonna. And Jerry was an investor and a board member, and in a way, kind of a co-founder of that startup. It was I think the kind of proto Reboot in a sense, because what we were trying to build was a learning and development platform that could take teachers, people that we would now call content creators, but of a particular ilk, like Jerry, really, and scale that impact through. Really, what we were trying to do then was like cohort-based courses.
Yeah.
In 2012, like really before Zoom was a thing, and
the world wasn't ready, Andy. The world wasn't ready yet.
That might be the way that we would say it to make ourselves feel better about the fact that it didn't work out. But I think it's at least partly true, and it's partly true that we made a bunch of mistakes. And so I was brought in for my background in small groups and education, and really what I was helping with product. At some point, we decided with what we were building that we wanted to be utilizing the principles of coaching more. Like Jerry had a vibrant coaching practice, and he was operating as a coach. He had his blog, The Monster in Your Head. He was already doing his thing kind of in the startup ecosystem. So we were aware of coaching. Like Jerry was maybe the second or third actual living coach that I had met, at that time. So there was definitely something there. No, but nobody on the actual staff was a coach. And I remember at one point saying, hey, we don't really have that expertise here. Shouldn't we have that? And we had this internal conversation, and it was like, yeah, maybe somebody should have that. And I was like, well, I'll do a training program. And so that company actually funded my coach training during that time. And so, yeah, I did really hit it off with Dan. We formed a friendship pretty quickly and easily. We went on a work trip together to Boulder in early 2013. That was where I first met Jerry in person. Jerry, if you don't know who Jerry is, if you're listening, Jerry Colonna is one of the founders of Reboot, which is the company Andy worked at, which we're getting to here. Andy was also a guest on episode 3. So if you want to go get that story after this one, it's there for you. I got to meet Jerry in person at an event in Boulder that he was doing with Parker Palmer, and Dan and I were there for that. Very cool. That event. Yeah. Yeah. And I think early on, even though we come from very different backgrounds, Jerry, I'm coming out of Christian ministry, Jerry's coming from, Buddhist background. Jerry from New York, you from the South, there's a lot of funny. Totally. Yeah. But there was this connection around, I would say it was around spirituality, but like a recognition of it was a little bit like maybe like real recognize real, like even if you're coming from separate, traditions, like, oh, there's something kind of going on for you that I can relate to here on this plane. I think maybe that's part of what really drew me to the crew that would eventually become the reboot, part of the reboot crew.
Yeah, that's fascinating to learn just how all of that happened. And so Reboot got formed. You would go on to lead coaching for all of Reboot and develop some of their kind of core products and offerings along the way. I've got a lot of questions about what that experience was like, but one of the things that I think I've learned is that talking about the things that have settled and you've integrated into your experience is really more productive than talking about the things that are active oftentimes, especially for public consumption. And so I'm actually not going to go way into leaving Reboot and all of the things that came out the other side of this. So I wonder if we wrap up this first half, more than half of the conversation now, with where you are now, because you spent years at Reboot, you did a lot of really important work there, and now something new has emerged. And I wonder if you could just share what that is and kind of where you're at now.
Yeah, sure. So at the end of July, beginning of August, I transitioned out of my role as director of coaching at Reboot, and I founded my own executive coaching firm. It's called Worksong. It's now been 3 months and 6 days that I've been operating Worksong, but who's counting?
Who's counting?
Yeah. And I would say maybe the short version of like what led me to that and the why behind that is like, it just had become increasingly apparent to me that the next stage of my growth as a person, as a professional, was to step out of the sort of protective, umbrella of, in this case, a really successful and well-regarded firm, and to make my own way in this work that I've been training in and cultivating in and practicing now for over a decade. It felt like the next step in my evolution as a man, as an entrepreneur, as a professional. So far, it's been great. I've probably had 3, 4, maybe 5, 24 to 48 hour periods of where the darkness kind of sets in. And as we know, this is like, it is part of, and it's, yeah. And not just the initiation. I mean, you and I both have worked with entrepreneurs who've been so for long periods of time, and it never quite leaves you.
Yeah.
So it's like a friend that's always there. You can mature your relationship to it, but it's kind of there. So yeah,
it's one thing to help someone else do that. It's another thing to get to meet your own friend in that way,
Yeah, and I think that's part of it for me. Like that's part of like what was important about me doing this. There is something about like being of integrity. Not that one couldn't be it without doing this, but for me, it was important.
Yeah. Can't help but notice in the context of where we began this conversation, the name of the company. And I wonder if there's deeper meaning there that connects to kind of the music and some of that other stuff and where it came from.
Yeah, absolutely. It connects to my love of music and the importance of music. It's kind of a mundane story. I was scrolling one of my Spotify playlists and came across this REM song that I have always liked. It's never been like my favorite song of theirs, but called Finest Worksong. And when I saw the title, it was around the time that I knew I was going to be taking this step, and I wasn't sure what I was going to call the new entity. And I was batting around a couple of ideas, and for some reason that word, as one word, all one word, stuck out to me. And at first I thought it was cheesy, and all I could see was like a musical note in the logo or something. I'm like, that's not going to work. But the more I sat with it and thought about it, the more, sometimes these things just choose you and they don't let go. And it's kind of what happened with the name. The more I thought about it, the more it just made sense. What do? I help leaders and teams work in a more aligned way and hopefully experience more joy along the way. And that's kind of what music represents for me, And then the idea of a work song just historically is like a thing that groups would sing in doing collective work as a way to bring joy and alignment. Mm-hmm. So it just kind of, at some point, I just realized it can't be anything else other than Worksong.
I love that. It's a perfect transition into what the second half of the conversation is going to be, which is about some of the books that I think shape the way you coach and also shape your client's experience of the way you coach. And I thought we would use that not as a way to talk specifically about the books in depth, but as kind of a framework for talking about what coaching even is and some of the things that you've learned and experienced and taught along the way. So we'll take a quick break. And when we come back, that's what people can look forward to. Hey, it's Barrett. You've reached about the midpoint of this conversation. And while we take a little break for station identification, as they say, I want to tell you about two things. First of all, I write a newsletter every Saturday for founders and creators who are leading teams and companies to make an impact through your work. It has 3 sections in it. The first one is a mini essay from me based on my executive coaching work with founders and creators about how to lead well. It has 3 long-form essays or links from around the web that will help spark new thoughts to help you lead better. And it has 1 quote from a meaningful book that I often find myself recommending to friends and clients. All the feedback I've gotten so far is that it hits exactly on the kinds of issues that founders, CEOs, and creators are facing every day in their work. So if that sounds appealing to you, make sure to go to my website at barrettbrooks.com and you can subscribe right at the top of the homepage. That's BARRETTBROOKS.com. The second thing I want to tell you about is that my day job, I actually do have a day job, I'm not just a podcaster yet, is as an executive coach, as I just mentioned. I work with founders of Series A startups and later, and with creators who are doing at least $1 million as a solo founder and are now thinking about growing a team. The uniting commonality between the founders and the creators I work with is that you've reached a point in your business where you know you're going to make it. Actually, you're doing quite well. And now the question is, how much do you want to scale? And what are the leadership challenges that you're going to face along the way? This work is based on both my training as a coach and in my work as an operator and growing my old company ConvertKit from $3 to $30 million in annual revenue. If you're a founder or creator who might benefit from coaching, or if you know someone who's looking for a coach, I'd love for you to check out my site and my coaching page at barrettbrooks.com/coaching. You can learn everything about how I work as a coach and also fill out a form to have an exploratory conversation if that sounds interesting to you. All right, that's all I got for you right now. There's no sponsors for the show at the moment, so consider me your sponsor. Let's get back to the conversation for the second half. We're back. So here's what I'll do at the start, because we probably won't get to all 5 of these things. But when I was thinking about having this conversation with you, I thought, okay, there is a curriculum here that is this kind of invisible fabric of what I think it's like for Andy to coach someone. And again, I'll continue foreshadowing that we'll get to why I've formed these beliefs near the end. But here are the 5 books. And if anyone wants to read them, if I were just saying like, here's your curriculum, if you don't have the money to hire a coach, or you just want to invest in yourself, but you're not sure if you want to work one-on-one with someone, here are the books in order, I think, that I would read them. So the first one is Helping by Ed Schein. And we are going to talk about this one for sure. And this one is maybe more important for coaches, but I actually think leaders of all kinds really would benefit from reading it. So that,
or even if you're on a team, if you're a team member,
and just
how read it.
Yeah. Or married, or in any kind of partnership, or it really is good for everyone. So this sets the global context for the kind of work that I think we both do. The second one is It Didn't Start With You. Why is it second? Well, it's a book about the stories we live, some of which are our own and some of which we carry on from our parents and our ancestors and people that came before us, and we don't have to carry anymore if we don't want to. And I think it's a huge part of the act of growing up, which is language that I think we both believe in. The third book is Let Your Life Speak by Parker Palmer. Parker Palmer is a wonderful teacher, created the Center for Courage and Renewal. And Let Your Life Speak is a very, very short volume, but a very powerful one about basically living into who you're meant to be as a human being, which can sound corny. And I embrace that is part of coaching, that sometimes we talk about things that sound corny and yet are still fundamental truths from my point of view. The fourth one is Transitions. And this was a new one that you introduced me to actually as we were prepping for this conversation. And the core of this talks about the difference between transitions in life and change, and how we go about handling transitions and honoring them as they come. And then the last one.
Did I really never recommend that book to you when we were working together?
But you
that's
did
crazy.
recommend Necessary Endings, which I think has a similar kind of flavor to it from a different angle.
Oh, yeah.
Which we could tell a funny story about what we want. Okay. And then the last one is The Wild Edge of Sorrow, which, as I foreshadowed earlier, is a book about grief and the many, many layers of grief as it shows up in life beyond the one layer that we most often talk about, which is the loss of humans that we care about, dogs, whatever, loss of people and beings in our lives. And the many other ways that grief shows up. So that's the curriculum. We'll see what we get to here in the time we have available. But I want to start actually with something that's not in any of these books, which is a quote that says, I'm either here to or willing to set a pick for you at the free throw line of life. And I wonder if you might share where that came from and how it reflects your coaching philosophy.
I love these obscure references. You're finding them all. It's kind of nice. So there is an old Cheech and Chong song called Basketball Jones, which I first heard in high school, and I somehow listened to it again. I have not watched any of those guys' movies or listened to any of the albums. When I heard this song, it stuck with me, and then I heard it many years later. And there's this line where the main character of the song says, I need somebody to set a pick for me at the free throw line of life. And I don't know why, but that phrase came back to me years later when I started coaching, and I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. I think that's maybe what I do. Maybe that's what I do. And so I made it my Twitter handle, and I think it still is or X, whatever. I'm a sporadic user of that platform.
You're what we would call a lurker.
Yeah. But even that, I don't know what's happening with my feed these days. That doesn't make any sense to me. So I don't even lurk that much anymore. But.
No, I hear that. I love that reference though. And I find it fascinating, just the different experiences we can have with music. For a quick aside, that my wife is this way and you are this way, that you listen to a song and you hear all the words, think about them, you process them, you're able to kind of like be with them. I hear a song and I only hear rhythm. All of my listening habits are built around rhythm. Hip hop, electronic music, like all of this stuff, I realized at some point was all rhythm based.
Yeah.
And I think I started realizing this when I would, my phone would just go on shuffle or whatever from Apple Music, which I used because all of my history of like mixtapes and all the stuff that you have that you can't get on just the services these days are still there. It'd be on shuffle and I'd get in the car and someone like you would get in the car and some song would come on and then I would notice the lyrics. When previously all I noticed was like the rhythm of a Young Jeezy song. Now I'm thinking, wow, I'm not sure what this says about me for this person to be riding in my car listening to this song right now. And so it's I just hilarious. Find it fascinating the different ways that music impacts us. But we'll get off on that rabbit hole more. So Helping by Ed Schein. I actually hadn't read this one before, and I read it in prep for our conversation. Now, there's two concepts that I wanted to touch on here. And the first one is, I wondered if you might share your perspective on what humble inquiry is and why it matters.
Yeah, so humble inquiry is a concept that I think Schein introduces in Helping, and then he went on to write an additional volume that just unpacks that concept. I actually read Humble Inquiry first before I read Helping. So that was kind of my gateway into Ed Schein's work. Yeah, I think what he means by that is it's the kind of inquiry that acknowledges that there are things that I don't know and that I won't know unless I ask. And the fact that I don't know them can have serious implications on a number of things. The relationship, the outcomes that this team is able to accomplish together. And so I think the reason he uses humble is that it underscores that not knowing. And also the need. Like, unless I ask, unless I engage in this inquiry, I'm going to be without something that could be quite valuable to me and to us. And so I lean into that humility when I ask a question that I couldn't possibly know the answer to already. And so he frames it as a core leadership behavior, and not just behavior, but actually like mindset, stance. And I think really, really masterfully also makes a case for why it's not just a nice thing to do, but like kind of a critical skill that impacts outcomes.
Yeah. And he applies it to almost every facet of life. I think one of the things I really loved is all the different ways and examples he uses to talk about this, whether it's caring for an injured or ill loved one, or being in a partnership or marriage, or at work and in teams. That it's kind of this like fundamental base layer skill set one can develop, or way of being is maybe a better way of putting it. That one can exercise that allows you to connect more deeply with people. We both notice this quote in the book, which is that, or here, I'll read it to you, and then I want to ask you a question about it. The essence of teamwork is the development and maintenance of reciprocal helping relationships among all the members. And when I read this, it felt both obviously true and at the same time a new way of looking at teams to me. It's like something that I think I felt but could not articulate in the past. And I think probably most leaders and team members have not heard it articulated that way and don't think in those terms, that teams are fundamentally about helping one another. So I guess I want to ask your perspective on, why is this true? Like, to what extent is this true in your experience and all the work you've done with teams, that helping is kind of the core?
Well, another thing that Schein says in that book that's always stuck with me is we organize to do work that we couldn't do alone.
Oh, okay. So I've always had a saying that I use, which is 3-person companies don't build jet engines.
Yeah.
And it's a different instantiation of the same thing, which is just to say, like, there are certain things that require teams to get done. And it's a lot of how the world works.
Yeah, exactly. And has always worked on some level. So in that sense, I think that's sort of like maybe the foundation. And then you can extrapolate from that. Okay, well, we organize to do work that none of us can do alone. Therefore, we need each other. There's going to be this kind of constant flow of helping each other that's going to happen if we're going to be able to do collective work well together. So I think it's true fundamentally, because that's just how human systems that come together to accomplish a common goal work. But then there's this, what he calls a kind of sociological lens through which we can look at that, which is that helping, it can be inherently fraught, because when I ask for help, or I put myself in a position where I make myself vulnerable when I ask for help, or when I even acknowledge that I need help. And that immediately does this thing to for those who are listening, I'm doing this thing with my hands, or I'm putting one hand above the other. It immediately creates this imbalance in the status or kind of power differential in the relationship. And what the person who's in the helper role does with that advantage means everything at that point. Do you exploit it? Well, you're gonna see eroded trust, and actually help is gonna be impeded. Or do you do subtle but powerful things to equalize that relationship that can allow the help to flow more freely? So that, to me, that's what was most profound when I first read the book, was just the way he kind of broke it down in that way. I'm so glad I read it at the very beginning of my coaching journey. And I told you, when we were preparing for this episode, that I wish it were a core part of every coaching curricula.
Yeah, and I strongly agreed with you on that. I have this hypothesis that one of the reasons that founders, and we both work with different flavors of founders and leaders of different kinds, might be resistant to this idea, is there is a vulnerability in embracing that it's even true. That, like, as a founder on some level, once you get beyond day zero, you are inherently dependent on all of the people that fund you, come to work for you, and you are going to progressively make yourself more and more vulnerable to the need for help from more and more people over time as your company grows. And I think acknowledging that is probably scary for a lot of people, that to name it and own it and embrace it directly. Like, we have all of these ways of trying to avoid that, demanding things from people and telling them exactly what to do. And the reality is, most of the time what we're saying as founders, and now we are both that as well, is I need help. I can't do it all alone. I think that's a scary and foreign feeling a lot of times when you're the kind of person who takes charge.
Yeah, I think that's true. There's an interesting polarity that can kind of play out there between, the vulnerability of needing help from an organization, and then being a founder and stepping in, like really taking one seat, and the special place that a founder plays inside of an organization. Both of those things are true. And there's a kind of a, back and forth polarity between those things.
A kind of dance between them.
Yeah.
Okay, the one last thing I wanted to touch on here, and I'll just kind of read it and then you can add comments if you have them on it, was in that same section where I really thought the team section was like the best. The whole book is good, but the team section I thought was especially powerful. He has these 4 questions that he says have to get answered when teams form. And I thought they were so insightful. So here are the 4 questions as he writes them. Who am I to be? What is my role in this group? That's number 1. Number 2, how much control or influence will I have in this group? Number 3, will my goals or needs be met in this group? And number 4, what will be the level of intimacy in this group? And he goes on to explain why all of these matter.
Mm-hmm.
I just thought these were, again, to see them written down makes it feel obvious, but I don't think we often create space for these to get answered when teams form. And so I just wonder if you have anything you want to add or kind of highlight on this one.
Yeah, I mean, those questions have been foundational for me in my work with teams. And I think you can connect those 4 questions to, say, the work of somebody like Amy Edmondson and the concept of psychological safety.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly the exercise that I described to you earlier that I often do with teams that are coalescing and coming together, where I invite them to share stories from their formative years and explain how those stories shaped, those experiences shaped who they are as adult professionals, is designed specifically to invite a kind of bounded vulnerability and intimacy, like testing things in that way. And when you see that you can have a conversation like that and it can result in a feeling of more connection and closeness, you might be more willing to, take more risks later. I think these questions are really, really important. It's also why things like vision and direction, clarity of direction, are so important. Like, if I don't know where we're heading together, it's going to be really hard to trust that I have a place here. If I don't know the future we're headed toward.
Right. That third question, can my goals be met here? How can I know if I don't know where we're going? Exactly.
Yeah. And that doesn't mean that the leader has to cast this perfect, pristine, crystal ball, vision of what it's going to be like. That's impossible. And it's impossible in startups. It's impossible in those early stages to know with any kind of certainty. But that doesn't mean you can't have a North Star that might evolve, might shift, but is providing some degree of constancy and something around which to align.
Yeah. It's like, does the container we're creating here together have room for your journey within it? That's just something that I always saw, even in recruiting people to come join a company, is, can you really understand the place that this role and company will occupy in their journey? Yeah. And can you embrace the period of time that will make sense for them? And then that there may come a time, which we may get to, when that transition is needed.
This connects back to, by the way, to the thing we were talking about earlier around facilitating small groups and the importance of explicitly stated and agreed upon norms. Like, it's one thing to know what a North Star is. It's one thing, to know that this is a place where it's safe for me to be a little bit vulnerable. But we also need to know, like, how are we going to be together? And that needs to be pretty explicitly stated. And then there needs to be an accountability mechanism that when we are not that way, it's speakable and addressable, and we can work with that.
Yeah, and I think there's a powerful thing there of, you say accountability mechanism. The easiest thing to imagine is like, and if you don't do it, you're fired. But you followed it up with that it is speakable. And sometimes that's enough of an accountability mechanism on its own, just to be able to say, hey, that's not how we do things here.
Yeah.
And in a group setting where everyone agrees on that being how we operate, that's enough sometimes. Is that in the conversation, we can name it.
Yep.
So accountability can be as small as that.
Absolutely, yeah. There's this story, I think it's in Dan Coyle's book, The Culture Code, where he has that whole chapter on Greg Popovich and the San Antonio Spurs. And I think it's in that chapter, maybe it's somewhere else, but where they talk about kind of the culture of feedback within that organization is something like, I'll try to get this right. It's something like, if you're here, it's because we believe you belong. But we have high standards here. And you belong here because we believe you're great. And right now, you are not living up to the standards that we that we keep for ourselves here.
And what we
and
think
it's
you're
like
capable of.
what we know you're capable of. So I always loved that that kind of approach to feedback, and that
you belong here, and right now you're not living up to how we are here.
Right. I
think that's beautiful.
Really powerful about that,
because it answers the question, what's my role in this group? Do I belong here? And the answer is like, you belong here first and foremost, and we need to remind you of that so that we can then say, step it up, basically. And we need more from you right now. Okay, I want to move on to, conscious of our time winding down here, to it didn't start with you. So we talked earlier about the ways in which kind of your early life and your parents shaped you as a person, and that's true of everyone. We get these messages, we form behavior patterns, belief systems, stories that we tell ourselves and about our past based on what we experience when we're very young. And, one of the core reboot teachings that I learned, and that I think you have talked about in the past as well, certainly in the context of your work there, is a huge part of leadership is growing up and sense making of our stories and our pasts and our patterns, and then making active choices about who we're going to become going forward. Like, to me, that's the core of this book, is it's teaching you some of the ways these things get shaped and helping you reveal to yourself, oh, I think that might be at play in my life. And so it really transformed me for that reason. But I'm curious, like, how you think about this book and its role in helping people develop.
Of the books that we're talking about today, this is not like one that I recommend to everybody necessarily. I mean, it came up in the context of our work.
So in what situations does it feel like it's important then, I guess, is the right question.
Yeah, well, I think there's lots of ways into thinking about epigenetic trauma or inherited family trauma or whatever you want to call it. And that is not my area of expertise. I should be clear. Like, there are practitioners who have made this like the core of their work. And so I think I would tend to recommend this book in a situation where I sense through the conversation, it's become apparent, not just to me, but to the client as well, that there might be some of that going on. And this is just one of several different books that I might suggest to someone if they want to explore that and kind of open up their sense of what might be happening here. I did some training with Mark Wolin at a training that he offered a couple of years back. And so I do think there's something really powerful to this particular approach. I mean, in many ways, this is what Jerry wrote about in his second book, Reunion. So there's different ways in here. There's the more like clinical trauma, Bessel van der Kolk, kind of the body keeps the score, and that works. So I would recommend this book when it feels clear to both of us, both me and the client, that this might be at play. There's something from up. There's something that is a part of my family story, my parents' story, my grandparents' story, the culture, or the people group that I come from, that we can sort of see it is showing up, and it's having an impact on the patterning of my current experience. I think I also love that the title is really powerful. It didn't start with you. There's like something very compassionate about that. Like, hey, you're part of a human system, and this is not just that you are some flawed, broken. It's not that you are some flawed, broken individual. Like, you're part of a system, and that system goes back generations. And maybe take a look at that. And how that might be impacting your current experience.
The reason this was so impactful for me, and I always love that you are so respectful of your clients, that you would never speak on my behalf, but this came at a time where I was really seeing a lot of this stuff show up, and we were talking about transitions of my own and what I wanted to do with my career, and there was just a lot going on. And I remember this book felt like it gave me kind of a roadmap to understanding the family history, or the family tree. And what are all of the things that have gone on in the family tree that have come to impact me and my life? And I went back and I thought about my mom's parents' divorce as she was leaving high school and entering college, and how that impacted their family system and all of the ways that played out. And then how that affected her marriage to my dad and the ways that she showed up in that relationship. And they're still together today, but they have very unique ways of relating to one another. And then I went back and I thought about the way my dad grew up, and all of the experiences he had growing up extremely poor in rural Wisconsin, and the experiences that he had with his parents, and his dad was an alcoholic almost until the day that he died, and just so much of that kind of thing. And it led me to actually take a trip this year with my dad to Wisconsin, where he grew up. It was really important to me. My brother and me and my dad went up there, and we went to all the places my dad lived growing up. And my hope was that I would hear stories that only could be accessed through that experience together, because he's just not good at accessing it. He doesn't know. And I had a sense, because of this book was the starting point, that that's rooted in pain. It's too hard to go back and relive this stuff. But in the moment, as we passed these buildings that he had lived in, the stories came out, and I would just hit record on my phone and just let it sit there while he would tell these stories. And there was a lot of pain, so many painful stories that we heard. And the core thing I took away from this book was that I was blending with my dad's story for a lot of my life. I was living an internal story that wasn't mine, that was actually his, about his worth and value in the world, that I think was a product of all of his pain that he experienced. And I realized it was important that I separate from that for me to be able to live the life I want to for my boys, and in my coaching work, and in my career, and in my marriage. And it really created space for me to start to address, okay, what is my story internally that I want to live with? And not let me take my dad's, which is kind of one that feels to me, my experience of him is that he feels like he's living a story of smallness and pain. And I said, okay, I can have compassion and love for that, but I'm going to separate from that now and say, I can live something different. And so that to me is the kind of thing that represents the value of the book, is it helps you explore those things and make them known in a way that maybe is invisible right now to you.
Yeah, it's really beautiful. And I think the thing I want to underscore in what you just said is the compassion for your dad.
Yeah.
And those things go hand in hand. There's the ability to sort of individuate from the story, but also there's this increased compassion
and closeness
for him, and closeness. Yeah. Yeah. Which I think is part of what's beautiful about an approach like this, is that, it's not just like, oh, that's not I have no connection to that. That's his, not mine. This sort of like distancing. It's a boundary with connection.
Yeah, exactly. It actually opened up more space for me to love him more deeply, to understand him more deeply, to seek that more openly. And that's been a beautiful aspect of it. I just feel a lot closer to him because of that. Well, as expected, we had 5 books we could have talked about. We've talked about 2 of them. So I'll leave those listeners who are on the seat of or edge of their seat hanging till our next conversation. And I want to move to our 2 closing questions that I normally ask, which is, what is the most beautiful version of the future that you are working to make come true?
Well, the context of my work is with leaders who have founded or are playing instrumental leadership roles inside of organizations. I do not have a very specific niche. I mean, I've tended to work with a lot of tech founders, but I work with people in all sorts of industries. So for me, the common thread is, regardless of the organization, regardless of the industry, helping leaders actualize in a lot of the ways that we have been talking about. I think the way you talked about it with your children is like such a beautiful corollary to this, like being more fully themselves, making space for the people they're leading to be more fully themselves, but in service of this common mission that we're on, whatever it happens to be, that there is this place where people can actualize together and do amazing work in the world, and that those teams are more effective over time. And it's just also so much more meaningful to operate in human systems like that. So I hope that that's the impact that I'm having, that my work is making some small contribution to more companies like that, more organizations like that in the world.
I love that. So I will reveal the thing that I have withheld the entire episode, including in my intro, which is that you were my coach for 5 years. And longtime listeners will know this already, because I will have referenced it so many times by this point in their journey listening to the show. But you and I worked together during massive transitions in my life, leaving ConvertKit, which I've done a decent amount of writing about, but then also going through a very long transition in who am I going to become myself from here, now that I've separated from this identity that I was so wrapped up in for a long time. Helped me through the transition to fatherhood and so many of those things. And I always describe it as you were definitely the second most influential person in my life. That's funny. My wife was the first, and you were the second most influential person in my life during this critical period.
Man.
And so I just got to be the beneficiary of all of this beautiful work that you do. And so that is the context that I think is most appropriate to reveal now, because people will have gotten to hear all of your beautiful story and expertise before it being in the context of our work together. And so that leads me to my last question, which is, I'm curious who you are becoming as you do this work with people like me over time.
Well, I don't know if this answers the question, but I think it at least it partially does. I was sharing with you when we were getting started how much got stirred up in me when you asked me to do this show. Obviously, when you asked me initially, I was floored and honored, but there was also another part of me that kind of rose up, which was like, who are you to go on a show like that? And what business do you have doing that? So I am on a journey, obviously, right? Like it was like, wow, I didn't even really know that sort of imposter syndrome was still kicking around in there, but it absolutely is. So I'm on a journey of my own growth and actualization. I am kind of constantly in this place of like, what does it mean to be more fully who I am and have that be enough, not shy away from whatever brilliance or creativity might be there. But also, I do feel called to this profession where I am in service. Like, I'm not the star. And I think that's right. I think that's where I am supposed to be. So this has been really strange for me to be in a place where I'm being interviewed by you on this amazing show. And I think I'm learning how to be in the tension of that, like how to be fully me and also stay fully in this place of others' orientation and service.
It's beautiful. Well, Andy's going to get out of here. He's got, I'm guessing, a coaching session to go be of service in. I'm going to read while he leaves a poem that Andy shared with me called Trees by Howard Nemerov, which Andy said was kind of a theme a theme for his work as a coach. So I'm going to read that, Andy. I'll let you get out of here. And that's how we'll wrap up the episode. Thanks for being here.
It's been wonderful to be with you. Thank you for asking me to do this.
Talk to you soon. All right, audience, here we go. So this is Trees by Howard Nemerov. To be a giant and keep quiet about it. To stay in one's own place. To stand for the constant presence of process. And always to seem the same. To be steady as a rock and always trembling. Having the hard appearance of death with the soft, fluent nature of growth. One's being deceptively armored, one's becoming deceptively vulnerable. To be so tough and take the light so well, freely providing forbidden knowledge of so many things about heaven and earth, for which we should otherwise have no word. Poems or people are rarely so lovely, and even when they have great qualities, they tend to tell you rather than exemplify what they believe themselves to be about. While from the moving silence of trees, whether in storm or calm, in leaf and naked, night or day, we draw conclusions of our own, sustaining and unnoticed as our breath, and perilous also, though there has never been a critical tree about the nature of things. That's Trees by Howard Nemerov, and that is a theme or work song for Andy's work. Thanks for listening. See you next episode. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Good Work with Andy Crissinger. If you couldn't tell through the episode, and I saved this to the end on purpose, Andy was my personal coach for 5 years as I led the team at ConvertKit, as I transitioned out of my role at ConvertKit, as I found my way to coaching myself. He has been one of the most important people in my life over time, but I wanted you to have the positioning on him for this episode that was about his work and not just about our relationship to one another. He is truly one of the best coaches, I believe, in the world. I think that's been shown through all of the companies and leaders that he's worked with over time, and the degree to which he is respected, not just by his clients, but by peers and other coaches in the industry. You can find Andy's work at worksong.co, and you can follow along with his journey going from leading coaching development at Reboot to his own company at Worksong on LinkedIn. So look Andy up. It's Andy Crissinger. That's Crissinger on LinkedIn. And of course, you can find all the links, the books, the resources, everything that we talked about in the show notes at goodworkshow.com. I'm your host, Barrett Brooks. This show is produced by my friends over at Podcast Royale. And of course, I could not be more grateful for you listening to this episode and for spending 2 hours with me, ideally every week. If this is your first time listening to the show, I'd invite you to hit subscribe wherever you get your episodes, whether it's Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or on YouTube, subscribing to the channel there. I'd love it if you would share one insight you got from the episode on social media or as a comment on YouTube. I'd just love to hear what you took away from it, what you're learning, what you're enjoying. Honestly, I make the show for you. And while I love these conversations and I love connecting with the guests, I really make it so that you'll benefit. So I'd love to hear from you. Drop me an email, bb@barrettbrooks.com. Tag me on Twitter, tag me on LinkedIn, tag me wherever you hang out online, and let me know what you took away from this conversation. That would bring me a lot of joy. And if you're feeling really generous today, I'd love you to grab the link to the show wherever you listen to it, drop it into a text message and share it with one friend. I know that podcasts grow through word of mouth, and that the most valuable thing that you can do for me to help me continue making the show is just to share it with one person you think will enjoy this episode. So if you love this conversation with Andy, I'd really be grateful if you shared it with one other person who would love it too. Thanks for being here. I'm grateful for you, and don't take your time for granted. So I'll see you on the next episode.